I'll tell you a little bit about how this intersects with the social determinants of health and why nutrition is so important. And I discuss this in my food security course that I teach downtown, Health, Nutrition, and Food Security, and that one is offered through University College and Health Studies. And really, when we think about the social determinants of health, if you were to look at the model, there are concentric circles. It's represented usually as concentric circles. And in the center of the model are those biological factors that are intrinsic to who we are that we typically can't change, like our genetics and our ethnicity. And then as you move meso to the outer circle afterwards, you see those societal factors and environmental factors that we're exposed to in our day-to-day, the communities in which we live, whether we live in a physical environment that supports a healthy lifestyle, like being able to walk, the walkability of a neighborhood, the workplaces that we live in, and are they conducive to the lifestyle that we have, and how we value child development and education. And one of the key factors that people really like to focus on is the access, the idea of access to health, access to care. And then, of course, in the outermost circle, we have those conditions in which we live in that are a little more distally related to us, but certainly that we're impacted by, like the governments that we're governed by, the policies that are in place, and the interventions that support these social determinants of health. What I find really interesting about this is that at the center of the model, we have those, like I mentioned, biological factors we typically can't change, and that typically predispose us to particular conditions. And we see this all too clearly with metabolic diseases like type 2 diabetes and cardiovascular disease, which in the trajectory of the life course are often preventable to some extent. So we can delay them or even prevent them. So when a person typically gets diagnosed with type 2 diabetes, it's usually in their 50s or so, but the risk factors for that condition occur much earlier in the life trajectory. But we just don't have the ability to, mostly because of funding, actually surveil and capture that earlier in life and be able to say to those individuals, here are your risk factors, here's what you could be working on to prevent or delay the onset of type 2 diabetes, and then all the things that often come with it, like cardiovascular morbidity. So when we think of nutrition, and the first things that you start to counsel a person with type 2 diabetes about have to do with those basic fundamentals on nutrition: how to eat well, how to have a balanced diet, how to control portion sizes, how to diversify the diet. And when you think about it, that's a kind of a shame that we wouldn't talk to people much earlier in life about these things. And that lends to the ideas around health policy and the fact that in schools you don't have an education system that supports nutritional literacy from a very young age. And this deficit continues through to university. And we see our students, for the very first time, many of them, going to university and making food choice in their lives, when prior to that, they would have made this decision as a family, or there's a family member who's often in charge of this. And so we're finally making food decisions for ourselves into our early 20s, and we're not really sure how to do that well. And so when we think about food security, we do often think of the various parameters within the domain of food security, such as food access, affordability, and on the extremes, malnutrition. But perhaps for our students, we're thinking more about access to affordable foods, and the fact that they have to make food choice for the very first time when they're undergraduate students, and what's available to them on campus. And if they don't have a vehicle or a means of leaving campus, then they're restricted to the foods that are on campus. And so we start to see the picture of food security in a little bit of a different light than what we think of when we think of global food insecurity. And you know what's neat is that the social determinants of health, because they are oftentimes modifiable conditions and therefore modifiable risk factors, when we look at the developmental determinants and we think of the model more on the developmental side, you would think that maybe there's not a whole lot we can do. We're born into the conditions that we're born into. But this really speaks to how we take care of people in our communities, and whether we prioritize education of the child, whether we prioritize pregnant moms and babies and the families therein. And so let me just get this term right, actually. I keep saying determinants of health, but there's another piece that I wanted to bring in. The determinants of health and disease model. And that's what really David Barker's hypothesis was all about. David Barker being an epidemiologist and physician and studying one of his first studies was really on the Dutch famine. So you're probably familiar with this. In 1944, the Netherlands was occupied, is German occupied, and the German army knows that they're kind of losing the battle. And so in resistance to this, they have a railway strike, and they stop food getting into the Netherlands. And so you end up having what became known as the Dutch famine. And that was a particularly bad winter. And so the people in that population, who, especially moms who were pregnant, they experienced extreme famine during this critical developmental time. The intrauterine growth period is so critical. And so lending to eventually David Barker's hypothesis and the fetal programming hypothesis that genes in utero are being turned on and off, sort of like switches, and are predisposing somebody to a life that will be able to cope with or not cope very well with disease. But this really also comes down to the body doing everything that it can to protect this developing fetus and prepare it for life outside the womb. But the stress test is what's happening in the womb. And so the fetus is developing for that life in utero, assuming that that will be consistent outside of the womb. But then there might be an inconsistency. That famine experienced in utero may not be the experience later on, hopefully not. But the disconnect actually has implications for the onset of disease later on. And so when David Barker and colleagues were able to study these now 50-year-olds who were born to these moms who experienced the Dutch famine, he was able to make these connections between the in utero period and the fetal programming that can occur and the later development of disease. So what does that tell us about what we can do now? Because I'm sure we're all interested to know, well, I'm born already into my conditions. What can I do now? And so this really has a lot to do with how we take care of ourselves, the food choices we make, the knowledge we have to make those food choices, and the techniques we adopt to be able to lower our stress levels.